Hello, welcome to another edition, episode. What is it? Who knows? Episode of the lockdown discussions with Influx Press. Me, Kit Kalis, Gary Budden.
Hello.
And we're on lockdown discussion 11, even though this is week 12 of lockdown, because we had a break because it was very tiring, wasn't it, Gary?
I think we've been content machines, haven't we? It's surprisingly, when you've got all the other stuff we have to do, to just recording this once a week is quite a lot of work, isn't it? I think it's good.
Yeah.
It's kind of kept us motivated, but yeah, we needed a break last week. We were a bit worn out from each other, weren't we?
Yeah, pretty much. I was tired of my own opinions. I think it was part of the problem.
I've always been tired of your opinions. So I know how you feel.
I think doing them like we set ourselves up to be doing them once a week, right? Because when we didn't know when lockdown was really going to end. But when you get to like 10, 11, 12, you're like, wow, it's actually quite a lot. I think if 6 would have been fine, but here we are. So today we are talking about self-publishing.
We are, yeah.
What do we talk about when we talk about self-publishing? Well, I think what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what we think self-publishing is, where the porous borders between radical publishing and self-publishing lie, what sort of writers or writing is self-published or isn't, or as a writer, whether you should be self-publishing or not, the industry around self-publishing, pros and cons, that sort of stuff, I think. But first of all, traditional now, is what have you been reading this week, Gary?
It's been like I said, it's been a busy 2 weeks, so I hadn't actually been reading that much because I've sort of been following the news quite a lot, as anyone who's watching this in the future might realise. The last 2 weeks have seen the Black Lives Matter protests really take off all around the world. Statues of slavers being toppled, all very exciting stuff that feels to me like there's a real sort of shift going on. So I will admit that has kind of taken my attention away from reading fiction perhaps as much this week. But I have just started this book by Elizabeth Hand, book of short stories called Errantry, which is absolutely fantastic so far. I'm on the second story.
Who published that?
It's an American publisher called Small Beer Press, who I think was set up by the writer Kelly Link. They do a lot of quite interesting American strange stories. Okay. I'm on the second story, almost like a novella called Near Zenor, which is also got links to your ancestral homeland of Cornwall, about an American guy whose English wife was obsessed with a children's writer who lived in Cornwall. And the children's writer turned out to be a bit Jimmy Savile in the end. So it's going into some dark places, and his wife has died, and he's sort of tracing what happened in Cornwall. Very, very good stuff. Really fantastic short fiction, I think. Really, really great prose. So
when you said the children's writer turns out to be, and then paused, I knew it was going to be paedophile.
Well, I just think of a delicate way of... yeah.
I mean, it was just going to go nonce, wasn't it? There was no other way you're going to go from... He was a children's writer, but where's the but? There's no but none.
No, unfortunately, no. So, but yeah, so going into some dark spaces, but really good, really recommended.
Interesting when you have that sort of subject matter as well. It is, if you're a really good writer with it, you can explore it in all sorts of different dimensions. When it's written badly, it can be really bad.
Yes, and I'd say what's good about this is this isn't really the main point of the story. Interestingly, it's more about grief and and things like that.
Okay, cool. I've been reading The Science of Storytelling by Will Storr. So Will Storr is kind of a journalist, mostly a non-fiction writer. He wrote a book called Selfie, A History of the Self, which came out a couple of years ago, which I really liked, which is basically the concept of individual identity from the Greeks onwards. And this is, although it says the science of storytelling, it's obviously not scientific, because you can't have a scientific way of telling stories, but it's kind of approaching stories and how they're written and what they mean and not necessarily in terms of like how you technically write a story, but in the sense of like how people tell stories. So the way that what people talk about, why they talk about it, the history of storytelling, and how we tell our own stories of our own selves. So the narrative of our life that we run through our head. That, let's say, so we've had a lot of experiences together, having grown up together, and then obviously doing Influx as adults. We've been in the same rooms for lots and lots of things. Your experience of that room may well be different to my experience, and yet that room will inform your sense of self, and it will inform my sense of self, but we'll have had different experiences of that room. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. That's the whole kind of Rashomon principle, isn't it? It's that great joke in The Simpsons. You liked Rashomon, didn't you? And he's like, that's not how I remember it. There he goes. It takes a second for the penny to drop.
I like that. That's funny. Right. Okay. Well, that's good. That's two good recommendations, I think, if anybody wants to pick them up. But I think we'll rock on to self-publishing. Okay. So my first question for us to explore, I think, is probably self-publishing has changed, I think, given technology. People often, when they talk about self-publishing, reference, or they talk about it in sort of positive terms, and I don't think we're neither negative nor positive about it. It's got pros and cons. They will often say, well, the Bloomsbury Group self-published, and Virginia Woolf self-published, and James Joyce self-published, and
Allen Ginsberg self-published.
And there's a lot of that to sort of say, these really well-respected, high literary figures of history are part of this self-publishing sort of line, like a lineage. That's it. But one would imagine self-publishing back then, A, was a lot more expensive, and B, required perhaps some sort of benefactor.
Well, just quickly jump in on that point. I was just doing a very, very brief bit of research before that, seeing what kind of famous books had been originally self-published. So you mentioned like Virginia Woolf, or was that the Hogarth Press, or was there an independent press? Anyway, like Swan's Way by Proust apparently was self-published. But I think when we talk about stuff from that kind of almost classic literary period, we do tend to be talking about, at least with the British writers we just mentioned, a sort of kind of I'm going to say this, an indulgence for the sort of intellectual elites and the work.
I think so. I mean, you can correct me if Virginia Woolf wasn't self-published, but I think the Hogarth Press itself was publishing each other, as it were. I think.
Yeah.
There's a sort of, you can have a circle of people that publish each other. And certainly, with someone like Joyce, he was published by the woman who ran the Shakespeare Company, but we pretend that that's some sort of like big independent publishing adventure, but it really wasn't. It was just that he couldn't get published elsewhere, so she stumped the money up for him.
Absolutely, and so for the purposes of this discussion, I don't think we're really talking about that stuff. I think it's held up as an example, but it's often not very useful, because I think some of the same people who would vocally support that form of self-publishing, because those writers are now seen as canonical, might perhaps sneer at modern self-publishing, which I think we're going to be talking about. Talking about the history of it, and you mentioned radical publishing as a sort of separate strand. I presume all around the world, but in the UK at least, this is a whole tradition that goes back to, I suppose, the days of since the printing press was invented. You go back to the English Civil War, printed pamphlets.
Pamphleteering,
Pamphleteering with sort of screeds and rants and all kinds of mad stuff about people's political or religious views. What do they call them? Broadsides or like folk songs would be printed in these ways. And that's a very interesting form of self-publishing that kind of does continue today. But we'll come to that.
Yeah, I think that depends how you view publishing as well, because is publishing necessarily a physical thing or not? Every time I post a tweet, I'm technically self-publishing.
Yeah, indeed.
So I think that what we term self-publishing nowadays is what we're talking about in terms of someone possibly what most people think of it is creating a book, not necessarily a
Yes.
physical book, but an e-book at least, but something that is recognizable in format as a book. I think that's what most people talk about when we talk about radical publishing, pamphleteering, which we will come on to. I think that's not necessarily, you don't think of that as books much of the time. At least I don't. I don't know. Like, when you go to the Radical Book Fair or whatever, there's lots of books, but there's also loads of zines, loads of pamphlets, and that sort of stuff. So, okay. So in that sense, if we need to set our own parameters, don't we really, for now? If I said I've self-published a book, what would you think I had done?
If for this theoretical exchange, do I know you, or do you just?
Because you'll be like, well, you wrote something about the Wu-Tang Clan and Arsenal, and you don't know me.
I would think that you had. You didn't have a traditional publisher, or you had chosen not to follow the traditional agent publisher route for whatever reason, and I would assume that you had got your text together, and you may or may not have employed a freelance editor to work it, and then you would have arranged for the entire basically editorial, copy edit, proofread, and production process, and you would have then produced that book yourself. So you may have arranged for it to be printed. You may have got, 300 copies of it printed, selling on your website or something like that. Or you may have done the kind of Amazon option where you can have, it could be an ebook, which is it Amazon Create Space? I think that's right. Or you might have gone down a print on demand route. But anyway, you'd have done it, it would have been not what we would call traditional publishing, or not even, is this the thing? Traditional independent publishing, like what we do. It's essentially operating in a different manner economically to that.
Yes, I would say it's when the author gets involved in production.
Yes.
I think that's
well put. Yeah, I think so, yeah. And presumably distribution as well.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. So, when people talk about, well, I own all the rights to my work. Most authors own the rights to their work. They kind of license them to a publisher. Essentially, when you sign a contract in traditional publishing, you'll say, yes, you can print my book, and there's all sorts of clauses, but one of them will be, if it's out of print for 6 months or it's out of print for a year, I get the rights back. So it's kind of like a license. It's kind of like a license. When you're self-publishing, you don't have to license it to anybody. You don't have to. You don't say to yourself, well, if I don't reprint this, I get my rights back that I gave myself. So I think essentially traditional publishing is letting someone else produce your book, make money out of it, and you allow them to do that for a fee.
Yes, and you also, in theory, this is a big theory. In theory, you reap all the benefits of that, of their publicity department. Your book will have visibility in bookstores. It will be, in theory, reviewed in national media, and so on and so forth. So you'll have a chance of, I suppose, selling copies in the kind of traditional sense, and being part of that cultural conversation, right?
Yeah, and you have you don't personally have access, but they have access to capital. That means they can print 20,000 copies at a very small unit cost, because obviously economies of scale work in that way, and you don't have probably the access to 40 grand or 20 grand or 10 grand or whatever it costs to actually do the printing, to even stump up that much. So I think with self-publishing, you are limited by your capital reserves, what you're able to put into the publishing of said book, which is why I think, maybe moving slightly on, the electronic ebook explosion also saw an explosion of self-publishing, and also the print on demand, because it meant it was much cheaper to access that production.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and I suppose there is a kind of democratization of that, which has a lot of benefits to it. So I can see why why it's appealing to people. You write your book, you may or may not get it edited into shape, and obviously there's a huge temptation to go, great, it's done, let's get it up there. Now, how you find your readers, that's a different matter, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Okay, so I think we're looking at like I said, so it's when author gets involved in the production and perhaps dissemination or marketing of said book. There are obvious benefits and not benefits. What's the opposite of benefit?
Disadvantages.
Something like that. To this process. So maybe I think you've, as someone who has self-published some work and also been published in a traditional manner.
Yeah.
It's going to depend on what you're writing, I think, perhaps. It's not just about your lack of access to the publishing industry. That's another thing we can come on to later. But let's pretend you are a published author traditionally, and you decide to self-publish. What would be the reason you would decide to self-publish?
I think that's a good question. So I'll use the example you mentioned. I've sort of self-published something, which was this. So anyone watching can see this, but I'll explain what it is. So last year, I did via Kickstarter a small book called The White Heron Beneath the Reactor, but which was done in partnership with the artist Maxim Griffin. So I'd actually been approached to see if I wanted to do a project through this thing called Make 100. The idea was you make a kind of limited run of something produced to quite high quality. I really liked the idea of it because I had some ideas sort of knocking around. I'd been writing something about Dungeness down in Kent, where the nuclear reactor is, a very evocative place. And this just seemed quite a fun thing to do. And I spoke to Max and thought, would you like to work together? And what was good for it for me was I thought, right, we can do whatever the hell we want with this. I can write this quite experimental, fairly odd, to be honest, piece about Dungeness, which it might have been able to be traditionally published. I don't think it would have fit into one of my other books very well. And what I liked about it is the fact we could just get on and do it. The reason I think it did quite well, however...
Do you mean in the sense of you can get on and do it because there's no one in your way?
Well, it's like I don't have to worry about, if I have an agent, I don't have to worry about showing it to my agent and waiting for them to go, this is great. And then I don't have to worry about sending it to editors and wait for 6 months for a reply. I do understand that frustration because although whilst we're acquiring editors ourselves, we do know what it's like from the other side, don't we, as writers ourselves. And it was quite fun to think I could do this alongside my kind of, let's say, bigger projects and just get on and do something. But I was just going to say, I think one of the reasons it worked quite well, and we're doing another book that should have been completed now, but coronavirus kind of got in the way of that. Is that both, I think Maxim and I, well, certainly not famous in any way. I think we both had enough of a following on online platforms and on Twitter and so forth that we could kind of guarantee a number of sales to make it worth doing economically. He's a professional artist. I know how to make a book and do the production stuff, which I think for me made the process very easy. Now, I'd imagine that's probably not the case for a number of potential self-published authors.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, yeah, you've got the experience of the production side of things because you run a publishing house. Did you use the printers that we normally use?
I didn't because they weren't able to do what was necessary. So I'll open it up because it's printed in colour in this kind of way.
Oh yeah.
I found a slightly different printer who I think we'd used once or twice in the past, but I knew what I was asking for. Do you see what I mean in terms of materials?
You know what paper stock, all that sort of stuff, how binding works, dust jackets, etc. And you also know how to typeset.
I do, but in the end, I used the money that we'd raised to crowdfund this to pay a typesetter to do it. Right. One of the typesetters we use at Influx, actually, because they're a freelancer. And I thought I'd rather get a professional to do this because I can typeset, but it's not really my forte. but I do know. I'm like, but I know a guy who can.
Right. So this is actually quite important, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
self-publishing this Heron Beneath the Reactor book. You would say was easy because you have the contacts. You know who to ask. You're in the biz, as it were, right? So.
And to add, yeah, and I'm sorry, I got a copy editor I know who I paid to. It's only 8,000 words, but I asked them to check it over and copy edit it for me because I know that I will be blind to certain areas in there myself.
Yeah, and that's the right thing to do. But you know, if you're Gary, if you're Barry Gudden, and you're living in, I don't know, Newport, South Wales, and you've never been anywhere near the publishing industry, and you don't know how book production works, you know, how are you even going to go ahead and produce a self-published work? You know, and that's where I think it's really interesting is what motivates a writer then to self-publish. And I suppose what I think it would be, because it's obvious to me why you would choose to do the way you did it, because you know it's not going to sell 2,000 copies. You know another publisher is probably not going to be interested in it for that particular reason, like it's economically not going to work, so they put their money behind it, and you know it's only 8,000 words and whatever, right?
But I will say, being able to crowdfund it, you kind of eliminate all the risk. We did X number of copies. I have a few of the paperback left, but all the hardbacks sold. So we already knew the project was worth doing, and there was, you know, this set number of readers. I liked that about it. But I don't think that would have been possible if we'd have been complete unknowns.
Well, no, that's what I mean. So with Barry in Newport, you know, is it ever advisable? Would you ever advise Barry to self-publish at the risk of not producing something as high quality as what you did, in terms of spending so much time trying to find an audience? Unknown Barry, you know, like what are the benefits to Barry doing it? In my head, the benefits of Barry doing it is maybe he hasn't found a publisher and he just wants the work to be out there and read by whoever he can find to read it. The sort of disadvantages of it are, I think Barry would spend a lot of time trying to find an audience. He may not find an audience and then be dispirited by that.
Yeah, I think so. But I think it interestingly ties into a lot of conversations that we've had and that are going on at the moment about who has access to the industry and things like that. You have to know what the process is, first of all, of getting a book traditionally published. And I generally don't think, because it's not particularly common knowledge, that many people at first know what the process really is. I don't think you and I did before we became involved in this.
No way.
So therefore, you might not even know how to get an agent's attention. You might not know what a literary agent is. I think a lot of people are still unclear what their roles are, especially outside of the publishing bubble, the London bubble, whatever you want to call it. But obviously, lots of people want to write, and lots of people are talented writers and have got a lot of interesting things to say who are not from those backgrounds or from that kind of world. And so the temptation to self-publish, I think, is a strong one. But the question was, should a person do it? I think it all depends what you want to achieve with your writing, right? Some people just want to have the book out there, right?
Yeah.
You want your book to be on the table in Waterstones and possibly reviewed in The Guardian. Self-publishing almost, I mean, there'll always be a few kind of exceptions to this, but self-publishing will not be the way to go because for whatever reason, self-published books are not usually treated seriously by the mainstream press. They're not treated seriously by prizes. They're often not considered in any way.
Wow.
So, sorry, I need to close this blind.
Sorry. I think so that's about kind of the industry itself. You know, like to pretend that the bookshops are not part of the industry and not wrapped up in distribution networks. And you know, if you're a I'm not going to use the music industry because it's different, but let's just run with this analogy. You've got a garden that's yielding some really decent fruit and veg, right?
Yeah.
You can't get that fruit and veg into Sainsbury's to sell it,
No.
right? Because you don't have the distribution channels to get into Sainsbury's to sell it. You probably can't even get it into your local co-op shop or whatever. But you could
No.
sell it to your neighbours or take it to a farmer's market
Yeah.
or be part of a growing community
Hmm.
or something like that, right? So it's about, I think, a lot of it is about, disregarding writers who already have profiles, who can self-publish and just shot books out like there's no tomorrow. But if you're new to the game, it is about potentially building that community first. Like
Yeah.
maybe giving a book to a couple of people, like I say, like you're giving your food to your neighbours, or getting involved in a growing community, getting involved with other people who self-publish, or
Yeah.
going to events and talking to other writers, and building it that way to then be able to access more readers, because
Hmm.
just publishing something won't get it read.
No.
And I think the danger of perhaps, so some writers do it very well, and some people are very good at marketing. Not everyone's good at marketing themselves. Not everyone's good at publicizing themselves. And the self-published writers who tend to come to the fore, as far as I can see, are the ones who are good at marketing.
Yeah, good self-publicists, good at marketing, good at essentially selling themselves as a product. I know there are various companies and people who help self-published writers, all writers, don't they? Kind of build that public profile. And there are examples of, I think this is on kind of Amazon and CreateSpace stuff, who are very successful because they know how to market themselves. So I would say if you're willing to do all of that work as a self-published writer, go for it. I would still say if you're expecting to be part of the traditional kind of literary conversation in the UK, that isn't going to happen, I don't think. Now, whether it should or not, completely different issue. I also think if you're a self-published writer and you write, I think the kind of ebook stuff on Amazon lends itself more to sort of genre writing, romance, horror, supernatural sort of thrillers and stuff like that. Not all of it, but I think you can have far, far, far more readers, and you can probably make more money than if you're a literary writer, but you're not going to be reviewed in the broadsheets. Do you think that's fair to say?
I think that's fair to say, and I think that is where we come to the question of what do you want to achieve with your writing, right? Because if you're some highfalutin literary writer, you want people to read your work in a certain way. You want it to be vouched for by cultural elites, perhaps, or just the culture in general, the cultural kind of matrix of your country. You may want certain authors to treat it with respect and reverence. You may want to be a part of the prize system. But if you just want your books to be read by shitloads of people, and you're quite happy writing a kind of pulpy noir or whatever, like I'm making that stuff up, but you can choose anything like that. Self-publishing on Amazon space could well be the way you do it, and I think there is, I don't know, maybe quite a thick line. People talk about thin lines between things, but I think there's probably quite a thick line between those two. Would you agree?
I'm just trying to envisage what the thick line means.
So in terms of the porousness of that line going between those two worlds.
Yeah, I wonder where the crossover is there. Yeah, I'm not sure where it is. There is a crossover between the sort of more literary stuff and self-published stuff, but I don't think it is on the kind of Amazon ebook stuff. I think you'd be more into the realm of what I would call more DIY publishing, where people might make limited edition texts of highly experimental work. Was where we've kind of veer into the sort of poetry world a bit more. I was going to say something. So I've done a few like lectures and seminars over the last year and stuff at a few universities, and often talking about. Actually, the theme was, what does small press mean? I think I've talked about this before because lots of terms are used interchangeably. So where I talked about what's a small press, what's a small publisher, what's an independent publisher, what's an independent press. So self-publishers fall under the independent realm, don't they? But I sort of split it into two categories. So I said you've got what we call DIY publishing, which I described as, I've got it up here, usually no national distribution. It's often handmade, limited runs, small readerships, of which this fits into that category completely. Whereas the kind of ebook self-publishing is not aiming for that, is it? It's aiming to probably reach as many readers as possible. So I think there's a bit of a difference between the kind of boutique, high production led sort of version of self-publishing, which I'm quite a sucker for, to be honest, with the what appears to be kind of sell it cheap, write quickly ebook sort of format.
I think there's
is that fair, do you think?
I think that is fair, and I think that indie label is, I think we can distinguish between indie authors and indie publishers.
Yes, and I think there is confusion between the two.
Right, because an indie author is someone who's an independent author. They're publishing themselves, like on a Kindle platform, or whether they may be doing it physically as well. An independent publisher is a publisher publishing other people, other writers, not themselves, but they're not part of a bigger business.
Yeah.
And I think there's sometimes when you get these stats on social media and people flaring up and why am I not included in X list? Why am indie publishing is XYZ, and people don't really understand the distinction between being an indie author and being an independent publisher. When we publish, we are publishing someone else, and we're putting our faith and resources behind someone else. So we're backing someone else. It's not about us. When an indie author self-publishes, they're backing themselves. Yeah. And then, so there's a different emphasis. I'm not saying, one's better than the other, although I do feel that as an independent publisher, when you put your weight behind an author, it makes other people feel like they can join in to get behind that author, and
absolutely.
If you're just chatting about yourself, after a while, it's a turn off. I think that's how
I think within the Anglophone world, at least, there's some cultural differences here. So we're both English, and I think there's quite an English tendency to find people who self-promote too much distasteful and a bit classless. Whereas I think I accidentally upset some American independent publishers a few months ago. Made some glib comment about, I don't know, indie publishing or self-publishing or something. But I think that in the USA, there's more of a culture of self-promotion and that being a good thing. Yeah. Whereas in the UK, I think, and this might be a way of, I was thinking about this might be a way of essentially trying to keep people in their place, a sense of having a bit more dignity about things and not blowing your own trumpet as much because it's seen as a bit crass.
It is seen as crass, and I can't help but be conditioned by that. And
me too,
And when I see it, I just go, yeah. And whether that's about who gets to, that's an interesting question, and something I hadn't really thought about actually. Is that system, that culture, about keeping people in their place? I mean, maybe it is.
I think all of English culture is about that. The older I get, and the more I think about all the sort of codes we have, I think it's largely to stop people saying what they need to say sometimes. Yeah, maybe. On the other hand, if you read the self-published book and it's absolute garbage, and this person's trying to tell you it's brilliant, well, maybe they should be kept in their place. I don't know. I think it's that's obviously a facetious joke, but I think there's an issue. People often have an issue with quality control. Yes, definitely.
Moving the conversation on a little bit to talk about the industry around self-publishing. So I think that the common conception of self-publishing, perhaps in the mainstream publishing world, including independent publishing, is that these books are not edited properly, and the quality control of that production from the words to the paper, to the dust jacket, to the design, it doesn't match up to the standards of the normal industry. Would you correct that's a perception? I think that's a perception.
I think it's a perception. I think it will be true in some cases. So the way I see it is, I've mentioned this in previous episodes, that I do, from time to time, I do some freelance work as a freelance editor via the website Readsy, which is a kind of professional site for editors and proofreaders, etc. So there's quite a few self-published or aspiring self-published authors on there. So they might ask if I want to work on their manuscript, and this might be as a copy editor or a full development or edit, and you do the work. I would never take on anything I think is like truly unpublishable. I think that would probably be the wrong thing to do.
But nothing is unpublishable if you self-publish.
Well, this is the thing. Okay, so I suppose my own personal kind of criteria, if it's, you don't want to give people, I don't want to say, yeah, I'll take your money, but this book's awful. Do you know what I mean? Like absolutely unpublishable.
Right, in a sense of unreadable, kind of like,
like
it's not going to be received very well, kind of.
Which has happened to me. I've declined things for that reason. I didn't say that, obviously. So you send back your edit, but of course the author doesn't have to accept any of those edits. They can ignore everything I say, and then it's still up to them what they want to do. So with Influx, it's different, isn't it? With most publishers, it's different. We there's a term, isn't there? Delivery and acceptance of a manuscript is part of the contract. So that means when both publisher and writer are happy with the finished result, and they both have to agree with it before it gets published, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the difference. So. And of course, I think economic concerns are a big factor as well, because if you are a self-published author, you want to get your book out there, you might not have the 800 quid to splash out on an editor. So of course the temptation is there to skip that stage. I think it's an absolutely crucial error to skip the editing stage. I know there are self-published authors who think editors have no place in modern writing life, which I thoroughly disagree with as both editor and writer. But you can see why the temptation is there, because you have to fund all of it yourself. And to do a book properly, you need it structurally edited, you need it copy edited, and you need it proofread. That's 3 people you could be spending, paying.
Yeah, and that's what the traditional publisher does, which is a cost to the traditional publisher. They burden that cost through manpower hours, people hours, whatever, and there's expertise and all that sort of stuff that they built up. That's
absolutely
all covered by the traditional publisher.
Yeah, and then add to that, you've got to get the book typeset. You need to know how to use InDesign or whatever. You've got to get the book cover design. Cost. And one thing before you carry on, which is why there exist these companies, which essentially what we'd call vanity publishers, who will sort of offer to do that stuff for you. They look like a real publisher, but really they'll just print the book for you, and then they won't do anything with it. So
and you'll be paying them money.
So I think I would like to think that Readsy, what they offer is a kind of fair way of doing it. I think the kind of vanity publishers are largely parasitic on people's sort of desires for their books, and sell them a kind of false idea. And that's something I've seen more of in recent years, that kind of stuff, which I don't like it. Don't like that.
So not editing the book essentially devalues the work, doesn't it? I think that's a very easy conclusion I can make. I think an unedited manuscript will not be as good as an edited one.
100% agree with you. There are people who disagree with us on that. I know that, but I think we're in agreement.
Yeah, that's fine. It does depend, I suppose. Obviously some people have had bad experiences with editors who've tried to tell them to change things that they don't want to change, and those editors have been wrong. I'm not saying that all editors are good, but everything needs an edit. No one writes perfectly. Apart from maybe whoever the Bible was dictated to. They write pretty well.
And then translated. But I agree with that, and we've said this before. When you see sort of giant authors who've become too big to edit, you can see it. You can see it in their books. The books get flabby. self-indulgent because no one's bothered to edit them because they think, right, well,
talking of self-publishing, Will Self is probably one of those authors, I think. But yeah, all right. I'm conscious of time. So I think, let me ask you a question. So, what would you say is the pros of self-publishing? Because we're talking about, we've got the cons, which is like, it doesn't get a marketing push. It doesn't necessarily, like, let's just say it's not this kind of super genre hard romance or whatever. But like, you just written a book and you're like, it could be non-fiction. It doesn't really matter. We've talked about the cons, which is, you don't have access to this distribution network of bookshops and stuff like that. You don't have access to the media. You don't have access to prizes. What would be the pros of it?
I think I've mentioned one of the pros already, and it's kind of the speed of doing it. You can get a project moving very quickly. You finish it, get it into shape, it's out there. But whether that's in a physical form or an ebook form, and that, like I said, with the project I did, that was a really gratifying experience for me. I think you don't have to worry about your work passing the sort of editorial test. So I think a real pro of it is if you're trying to do something, a project, but let's say it's got some very forward-thinking or very controversial ideas that you think might be a barrier to traditional publication, not because of the quality of the work, but because of, well, maybe mainstream publishing is not really ready for this, which is again a conversation that's happening at the moment. Something I think is very, very true. There are certain types of narratives and that simply were not being seen on that kind of big publishing level. I think that's fair to say.
Although small publishing has certainly plugged a lot of those gaps.
It has, and it's doing a lot of the work. I think that the kind of big five publishers or the Johnny Gellers of the world should have been doing. But I do think if you want to, or you're writing something extremely experimental, you just bypass that whole system. You don't have to worry about it, and you can get it out there. I think it really benefits you though if you've already got a profile.
Yeah, I agree. So before we finish this, let's touch on what we mentioned before, the radical publishing side of things. So at the very beginning we talked about pamphleteering and that sort of self-publishing. Now I've got something in here that I picked up from the Radical Book Fair a couple of years ago, which is a little pamphlet about William Coffey, who was a Chartist, and we all know the Chartists, I hope. But he was a black man and one of the Chartist leaders. He was, it says on the back here, one of the leaders and martyrs of the Chartist movement, first mass political movement of the British working class. Coffey suffered for his political beliefs and activities. In 1848, he was put on trial for treason and was transported to Tasmania for life. Now, I read this, and it's not. I would be critical of this typesetting in a book normally. Let's say, put that lightly. But this is a story. We learned about the Chartists at school. We were in the same history class. This never came up in.
No, of course not.
Class, right? And actually, I read this and it was a complete revelation to me. And, obviously I'm not taking it, I'm not taking it as absolute kind of like absolute truth. So I did a little bit of digging. It is totally true. The story is absolutely, vouched for, ratified by other historians and stuff like that. And there's, at the back, there's also notes and references. So this is done as non-fiction in a very, very watertight way.
Yeah.
Now it's been stapled, printed, probably on a printer, I would have thought. And where else am I going to buy that? If the person who wrote this didn't self-publish it, how am I going to find it? And that's because of the radical nature of it is what interests me. It's not a story that they've written because they want to write about the time that their wife left them or whatever, right? It's about a forgotten personal history, and they're being able to inform someone like me who thinks they know about the Chartists and go, well, you don't know everything. And I think that follows in the radical tradition of changing what we think of stories and storytelling. And
I think I was at the Radical Book Fair. I think we were doing a stall there. I remember you buying that. Do you remember what stall you bought it from? Because I know shops like Houseman's. If anyone doesn't know Houseman's,
it might have been the 56A info shop.
Okay, so that's a good example. So
South London.
So it wasn't the writer of that pamphlet on the stall, but the kind of these kind of radical bookstores and those kind of what would you call them? Not
social
community
spaces.
Like social centres, like 56A. They would often kind of be places where you could essentially give or drop off these pamphlets that you want. So they act as a sort of DIY distributor, don't they? And I know if you'd go to Houseman's, you'd find stuff like that. And I know there are kind of zine libraries. I think 56A have one. But yeah, no, I agree with it. That it's a very different thing. And for me, probably found it more. That's what I find more inspiring about kind of self-published stuff. So I've got a couple of things here. I know one that you would like. So this ended up being published traditionally. So if anyone who's listening, it's the first edition of Savage Messiah by Laura Oldfield Ford. Introduction by Mark Fisher. We're worth it just for that introduction. These started out life as a zine. So if I open it up, you know, that style, which was consciously taken from that kind of 80s crass anarcho-punk DIY zine style, but mixed like with heavy doses of sort of social commentary about London, psychogeography, quotes from Ballard and all this sort of stuff. And again, I think that was a great way where she could just get those ideas and that style out there. And
that would not have been traditionally published.
I don't think it would
gained that following either.
Yeah,
even though Verso is a left-wing publisher, they wouldn't have, like, she built that audience from, and that she didn't just release it as one book; it's several.
Yeah, this is like many issues of it, done in that very sort of cut and paste DIY style, but with some, you know, amazing ideas in it. One of my favourites. So that's a good example of, I think, radical publishing. But different to just straight non-fiction. These are like short stories and sort of poetic musings and stuff. And another one I've got here, an American example, is this is an anthology of some of the comic bus scenes that came out of one of the American punk scenes around Berkeley in California. Similar sort of style though, that kind of black and white style. But I was just going to find. So this has an example, something that was really inspirational to me as a writer. I'm trying to find it. Talk amongst yourselves. Here it is. So this was an individual issue. If you can see that, it's called Lanky, Comic Bus number 47.
Yeah.
But that issue is essentially a short novel or a novella.
Right.
All written in his sort of, I don't know why he writes in all capitals. That will probably make some people.
Right. Well, see, this is what's interesting about it, because so my other example is a friend of ours, Paula Varjak.
Yes. Yeah.
She's a poet. She's been traditionally published as well, but this is from a long time ago. Called, at least it's not Sunrise. It's got her poems in it. I bought this from her, so she obviously printed a bunch, and then I bought it for probably like a £5, I think, at one of her gigs, because I really liked her poems and I wanted to sort of read them when I got back. And I quite like it. It's got like photos and it's got a real sense of her in it. And that's poetry, which is not necessarily, I mean, her writing is not what you might call in that same vein as Savage Messiah. It's not that sort of anarcho-punk radicalism. There's a certain radicalism to it, but it's also just a lot of it's kind of straight poetry. Or not, it's not straight in queer
I know
sense,
what you mean.
But you know what I mean. And I think what we're looking at here is what's interesting about the stuff you were talking about, Savage Messiah and the Comic Bus, is the physical object is part of the fun of it, isn't it? It's having that cut and paste DIY aesthetic, the design, all that sort. That doesn't come into what we were talking about earlier of the more ebooky Amazon version of self-publishing. Yeah,
and they feel like very different things, don't they?
They do, yeah. I think they do. And again, with poetry, I think poetry has been self-published forever. Like, you know, it's one of those spaces where I think self-publishing excels. And then, you know, that William Cuffey pamphlet again, like a different type of self-publishing. And I wish sometimes with the discourse around self-publishing is we should be able to distinguish between these different types, right?
Yeah, that's why when I was talking to these students about this, I tried to split it into what I call DIY publishing and self-publishing. That's my own invention, but I just think it's sort of neatly suggested the difference between them.
So this is the thing, is like, what is the DIY publishing has a different aim somehow than self-publishing. Is that what you think?
And I think it's very much rooted in the spoken word poetry scenes with that long tradition of self-publishing. It's very much rooted in zine culture, independent comics, and it is rooted in the kind of zine culture that exploded out of the punk movement in Britain and the US. It's related to all of those things, and then goes back into that tradition of pamphleteering and all that. And I just feel it's not people wanting necessarily to just get their novel published. And as you said, the physical sort of format of it is really important. I actually wish I had some of the zines I have of these, but they're all in a box at the moment because I'm in the middle of a house move. But so these are just the sort of book versions of it. But I
think there's also an element of, so what we were talking about before of people not being ready for publishing, not being ready, or saying things that perhaps are too vanguardy or too far forward. So much of that zine culture in the 80s and 90s existed around queer culture and that sort of radical feminism, radical queer culture, where you didn't have an outlet, and that culture built a lot of the arguments that are now mainstream today were fulminated or whatever in that culture 20, 25, 30 years ago. I think that's definitely really interesting. Is so what is being published now in the DIY scene may well be mainstream in 20 years' time. And that's why, as publishers, and I think both of us have a strong interest in that DIY scene anyway, because we come from it. But it's like we want to stay on top of it. We want to keep involved in that. We want to keep reading that stuff because we know the cultural impact it can have along the way, And that's different for me than, say, reading a self-published novel that's just a very sort of normal story, that just hasn't made it to an agent or hasn't got into another publishing house.
Yeah, I would agree with you actually. Now I think about it, I think, having attended the radical book fairs and the London Anarchist Book Fair for, I think, as long as I've lived in the city, and other stuff before that, they were the places where I was probably exposed to some of those ideas for the first time. And what I always liked about it was these pamphlets they'd either be free or they'd be like 50p or something, and you'd come away with a stack of all kinds of weird stuff that you couldn't buy anywhere else. And that is a real amazing thing. So I like what you just said there. I think people should look at these things to see where the kind of vanguard of the discourse is happening, because I do believe that's probably where it is happening.
I think that's a good place to start.
Well, actually, I was going to ask you a question. We've got a little bit more time.
Yeah, go
on. We're both writers. We've both had certain projects that have stalled or not been picked up by. Been picked up by. We both have agents, but certain non-fiction projects may have not got the interest that we wanted. So my question was: would you ever consider self-publishing something, or one of these projects that maybe haven't found a home in a more mainstream publisher?
That's interesting. So my experience,
you have a following.
Well, yeah, kind of. I think. Charles Manson had a following. Having a following is not, the best thing in the world.
It's not necessarily a good thing, is it?
I think for me, so my proposals that have been rejected have all been non-fiction. They've all been non-fiction books. I've not written. I have written novels, which I've shelved myself. These are not things that I've necessarily sent out. But the non-fiction proposals I sent out with my agent, which have been turned down, fundamentally require quite a lot of money up front to execute. So the one I mentioned a couple of episodes ago about cricket required a lot of travel around the country, staying in B&Bs, in hotels, whatever. So in order to write the book, even before I self-published it, I'd need a lot of capital.
So what about the crowdfunding option? That was one thing that when I did this Kickstarter thing made me think, certain projects are possible, because you can take out that if there's no interest in your book, no one pledges for it, and it kind of dies, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think I would, a crowdfunder that died would, I think a little part of me would also die along with it. So
it would be very dispiriting, wouldn't it?
And I think, up to a point, I do trust other editors. And if other editors are saying, do you know what, yeah, this isn't going to work, or this doesn't have a market, or whatever, then I'll sit there and think, yeah, it probably doesn't. But, if I thought it was something they weren't ready for, now, not being ready for a book about traveling around the country playing cricket with different communities, like, we're not talking about, if I was writing something that was truly radical, then I may well think about self-publishing it. But my very nature is that the stuff I write, I tend to write sort of slightly more populist stuff anyway. I like publishing radical things, and like reading radical things, and I like supporting radical culture. But I don't think I am a producer of that myself necessarily. But you're right. Like, I wouldn't not do it. It would just have to be the right project. What about you?
I think for the kind of non-fiction project, the same thing as you. I think I am willing to listen to the industry to an extent. Again, it made me rethink, what do I want to achieve from it. I still wouldn't say no to doing that. I definitely think I will do more stuff in the vein of the Kickstarter book I mentioned, White Heron Beneath the Reactor. Like I said, there is another one coming that just got stalled because of the current crisis. I liked working with someone. I like working with an artist an awful lot. That was really good fun, just to think outside the box a bit, and you can come up with the more experimental work and get it out there. And having the good fortune of having a small following meant it becomes feasible to do that. So I will definitely continue doing those, I think, but I don't think it would replace traditional publishing. But I think it's a nice thing to run alongside it, I think.
Okay, that's nice. I think that's a nice place to finish it, Gary. Let's just do that. Okay, so the conclusions are kind of, do it if it's right.
Yeah. If it's right for you, do it.
Good. Right, well, we'll be back next week, I assume. And next week we're going to be doing the auxiliary spaces around publishing, aren't we?
Yes, as you call it, the ecosystem.
The ecosystem, which could be quite interesting, I think.
I think so, yeah.
I think slightly kind of bit of a development from this one, perhaps.
I think so. I think we actually started touching on some of those issues. So, yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks for watching, listening, and we'll be back next week.
Okay, bye-bye.